Hi, good day. I'm Adrian van Breda. I'm the official lecturer for this module. And because in the fourth term, instead of having 7 weeks of class, we usually only have six, we struggle to fit all seven lectures into those 6 weeks. So this particular lecture, Unit 3 on Generalist Practice, is going to be offered to you online rather than in the classroom. So my name is Adrian, professor here in the Department of Social Work, and we're talking about generalist practice. This falls into the middle part of our class this term. So we start with an overview of generalist practice, and then in the next two classes, we'll focus in on micro practice and then on meso and macro practice in a lot more detail than what I can cover today. So today is the broad overview, and then the next two classes go into a lot more detail about each of them. So generalist practice is the idea that we are training you to work not only in very specialized fields or parts of social work, but really to be able to work across the whole range of practice. And we refer to this as the micro, meso, macro continuum. So macro interventions are generally focused on communities and organizations. So if you work with a whole school, or if you work with a neighborhood, or you're working in an informal settlement, we would call that macro practice, macro interventions at the big level. Meso interventions refer to work with groups, usually quite small groups. So groups might range from 5 to perhaps 10 or 12 people. A big class like our class, we would not really consider to be a group because it's just too big. There's almost 100 students in the class, and that's not really a group. But when we break you into small groups in class, then that's a group. So generally, meso interventions are done with fairly small groups, depending on their focus. And then the third component of generalist practice is micro interventions. And these are interventions that we do with individuals, with couples who may be married or not married, and with families. And so because they're all kind of small groups, we regard them as micro interventions. Now, I imagine that working with an individual is obviously micro. Working with a family, you might think, well, that's a group of people, isn't it? Why is it not group work? And we'll talk a bit about that during the course of today's class. There are advantages and disadvantages of the generalist practice approach, which we'll talk about later in the session today. But I guess the main thing I want you to take away from this particular screen is that micro, meso, macro. So from small to medium to big. But we're going to teach it in the other way around. We're going to start at the macro level, and we're going to work down to meso and then down to micro. And we really want you to think about social work in that way. So think about yourself being placed in a community and all of the issues that that community experiences as a large collective of people. And then within that community, think about smaller groups that exist there: churches, schools, classes, projects, various other groups that might be meeting in the community. Even just people living in the street might have formed a small group, and they get together and have meals or celebrations together. And then within each household, you're going to find individuals and probably also families. And so we tend to think of starting from the big picture, macro, and working down to micro. So you're going to need the textbook by Kirst Ashman, Generalist Social Work Practice, because this is the key textbook for this course, and is the key textbook on this generalist social work practice. You will find references to generalist practice elsewhere, for example, in Leila Patel's book on developmental social work, social welfare. But the core textbook is Kirst Ashman's approach and Kirst Ashman's model of generalist practice. So make sure that you're reading that when you do your class preparation. So I'd like you to pause the video at this point, and then read the section on work with communities. That's on page 155 to 157, and that's in the 2017 edition of Kirst Ashman. If you have a later or an earlier version of the book, just again pause and go and look for the section that speaks about working with communities, and you should find 2 or 3 pages of literature on that. And so pause the video here, and once you've read that section, come back. All right, so welcome back to macro practice. I hope that you've read those few pages and that you have a good sense now of what macro practice is about. I'm going to ask you in a few minutes to pause the video again and to read and to answer the following 4 questions. So let me run you through these questions. The first is, what are the 3 forms of macro practice as defined by Rothman in 2001? So Jack Rothman was one of the early people who developed the concept and the practice around macro practice or community work. And he talks about 3 different forms of macro practice. And I want you to go find out what those 3 forms are. And then I'd like you to try and explain in your own words what each of those are, and then to come up with an example of that. So once you've read the book, close it, put your thumb there. So if you need to go back, you can find yourself, and then talk to yourself and try to explain. Otherwise, if you could form a little group with a couple of other people, you may want to watch this video as a small group and chat about it amongst yourselves. The third question is, which of these 3 would you feel most comfortable with? So of those 3 forms of macro practice from Rothman, which of those 3 would you feel most comfortable doing? So try and imagine yourself being in practice. What feels most comfortable for you and why? And then on the other hand, question 4 is, what would you feel least comfortable with? And why would you not feel comfortable with that particular macro approach? All right, so those are the 4 questions. Pause the video here, keep them on screen, go and look up the material and see if you can come up with some answers to those 4 questions. All right, well, I hope that discussion and that reflection a bit on macro practice has been helpful for you. I'm going to just talk you through some of the key macro practice skills that we use in our department here at UJ. So these include, first of all, listening and empathy. We might not think of listening and empathy as being something that we would do at this macro level when you're working in a whole community or a neighborhood or a suburb or an informal settlement. But actually, we always need these listening and empathy skills. Your capacity to listen to individuals, families, groups, and communities is absolutely essential. It is the foundation of social work. You would have learned that in first year, where you did quite a bit of work on listening and solar, those kinds of things. And then empathy is the capacity that we have to feel with other people. And so as we listen and we hear the concerns of people, we also feel and express our feelings about how life can sometimes be challenging, but also how that there are strengths and capacities and opportunities in this community. And so this feeling with is what empathy is all about. Second important skill for macro practice is advocacy. And advocacy is about lobbying for change on behalf of others. So an advocate is a person who speaks on behalf of someone. If you think in the court, if you've been charged with some crime, you would hire a lawyer, which we call an advocate, and the advocate, the lawyer, would argue on behalf of you that you are the innocent, actually, and have not committed a crime. And so in advocacy, we would lobby for change. We would pressure local government, the ward councillors, members, leaders of the community to facilitate change on behalf of the community. It's a very important skill in macro practice. Thirdly is community mapping. Community mapping is where you literally map out potentially on a map that you could have downloaded from Google Maps, or a map that you draw for yourself, or even a very old-fashioned map book that we used to have when I was a young person. And on that map, you would mark out, in other words, map out all of the assets, the resources that people have in the community. Where is the local shops? Where is the local clinic or hospital? Where could you find a church? Where could you find a community hall where you could have a meeting? Where do kids hang out? Where do the youth hang out? And so you would map all of these resources onto your map. It may even be that there's a lady who lives on the corner house of a street, and she's the one who's always sitting on her front stoop on the patio and watching everything that goes past. She knows everybody, who's doing what, who's doing good stuff, who's doing the naughty stuff. And so she would be an asset, a resource that you could mark onto your map. You may also notice that there are patterns of how people move around the community. And you may, for example, see that on Friday nights, large numbers of people will meet at a church or at a venue. And that would also be something to try and keep an eye on. So that's the skill of community mapping. And then the fourth important skill in macro practice is project planning. Because you will be facilitating the community to try and address the challenges that they face and to help make things better in this community, your role very often is to help them with mapping and planning out that project. And we use various techniques for that. For example, the PERT chart, planning, implementation, and revision technique. And what we do with the PERT chart is that we map out all the different activities and in time. So this needs to be done first, that needs to be done second, that needs to be done third. All of the activities get mapped out according to plans, times, and who's going to be involved in them. And so we plan projects involving many people. Macro practice is not about you doing everything yourself. It is really about facilitating the community to do for themselves, and you are there as an enabler. You will learn about all of these skills, particularly skills 2, 3, and 4 in third year, because in first year, you're going to be working at the meso and micro levels. But in third year, you will start working at a macro level. And these are skills that you will learn in your internship class. So there's a couple of videos available to you in the learning guide for macro practice. And if you have your learning guide and you go there, you'll see that there's a video about the Grameen Bank in India, and there's a video about the phone ladies in Bangladesh, which is also in Asia. And these two videos give you a sense of how one can work at a macro level in communities and how those community members then begin to form networks amongst each other, begin to share and collaborate, and really make a difference at the level of the community macro level. And so I would invite you at this point again to pause the video, go and click on those video links for macro practice in your learning guide, and then come back as we move over to meso practice. See you just now. All right, so welcome back. We've talked about macro practices, the sort of very global picture of what we do in social work. And now we're looking at the smaller level, which is meso level. And meso practice is really about work with, usually we would say, small groups. So this class, when we meet all together, 100 people, we say that that's not actually a group, it's a collection of groups. But your tutorial classes, which are usually about 15 or 18 students in a tutorial class, we would call that a group, actually a kind of a large group, but still a group. When you start meso practice in the second semester of this year, you will normally have maybe 5 to 8 people in a group. So we're talking small groups. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you again to pause the video and read the section in Kirst Ashman on work with groups that you find on pages 150 to 155 if you're using the 2017 version. If you're using another dated version of Kirst Ashman, just look around to find the section on working with groups. And scan also the highlights 5.3 and 5.4, which provide some sort of practical examples around meso practice. Okay, so pause the video here. I'll see you again in a few minutes. Okay, so I hope that was helpful, those readings. And in a little while, I'm going to ask you to pause the video again and to answer the following 4 questions. So the first question around meso practice is, in your own words, explain the difference between treatment groups and task groups. So these are two main categories, treatment groups and task groups. And I need you to understand what the key difference is between them. Secondly, under treatment groups, there are different types of treatment groups. And so go find out what are the main types of treatment groups. There are probably 4 or 5 different types of treatment groups. Go figure out what those are. And thirdly, go and find out what the main types of task groups are. So know what the treatment and task groups are, and then have examples of each of them. And then fourthly, I'd like you to think of groups that you have been a part of and to identify whether they were treatment groups or task groups. So for example, if your tutorial class is that treatment or task, if you are a member of a committee at church, for example, is that a treatment or a task group? If you're teaching Sunday school, is that a treatment or a task group? Right? So think about the kinds of groups that you might have been in and try and identify which type of group you find yourself in. Okay, so pause the video and go and look up for the information and see if you can answer these questions. Good, I hope that you have these two things clear in your mind now. Really, really important that you understand the difference between treatment and task. Here are some of the meso skills, the main practice skills that we use for working with groups. The first is listening and empathic responding. And you might remember that we said that that was two of the skills in macro practice. Listening and empathy are absolutely vital in not only macro practice, but also in meso practice. And so you need to listen carefully to each of the individuals in your group. You also need to listen to what's happening in the conversations between individuals in your group. And in all of this, we want to be feeling what's the feeling of the individuals, but also what's the feeling of the group? What does the group feel like? Does the group feel crunchy today? Does the group feel tired today? Does the group feel irritable today? Does the group feel a bit hostile today? Do you feel you're being attacked by the group today? So this empathic attunement, being attuned to the empathically to the feeling of the group, is an important skill in meso practice. A second important skill in meso is group contracting, and this is where we set down group rules and norms for how we agree to interact with each other. And usually we would write all of that up on a big flip chart. And if you don't have a flip chart, we'd find a piece of paper. We'd write this down on a piece of paper. So the group rules are important. And it helps us later on, if there's conflict in the group, we can go back to the group rules and say, hey guys, but this is what we actually agreed. Let's apply the rules that we agreed to. A third set of skills in meso practice is thinking group and scanning. And so the idea of thinking group is that you think about the group as a whole. So if you've got 6 or 7 people in your group, think about all 6 or 7 of them as a collective together, rather than just thinking of John and Lungile and Moses. So instead of thinking of each individual, what you should also be thinking about is thinking about the group as a whole, the group as a group. And we call that thinking group, thinking group. So not just focusing on individuals. And one of the ways that's quite helpful to think group is to constantly scan what's happening amongst all the group members. So let's imagine that Thabo is talking at some length about something that's troubling him. You would look at Thabo, but periodically, as you're listening to him, you would also scan the faces of the other people in the group to see, are they interested? Have they lost interest? Do they look irritable? Are they feeling angry? Is someone looking tearful? And so you would keep scanning the group, and then you would come back to Thabo because he's the one who's speaking. But you will always be scanning, visually scanning what's happening in the group as a whole. And so you'll be doing this with your head the whole time as you run the group, is just sort of slowly scanning, either with your eyes or your head across the group. And then the fourth meso practice skill, a fourth, because there's only 4, but there's many, but these are 4 important ones, I think, is about reaching for difference and reaching for consensus. They sound the opposites. So reaching for difference is about exploring points of difference among group members. You might be trying to deal with an issue in the group, and a few people feel very strongly that this is what we should do. And another few group of people in group within the group may say, no, we should be doing something different. And so reaching for difference would be, I hear I hear this group saying this, and I hear your group saying something different. What do we think is going on between these two different views? And so we reach for difference. We don't hide away from difference. We don't try to always have everybody agreeing and being exactly of one mind, but rather we recognize difference between group members, because in the real world, we're always different, disagreeing with each other, right? And then the second part is reaching for consensus. So as you explore the differences, you'll also be listening for, okay, so we have a difference on this and this point, but we do seem to agree on these 3 points. And so can we agree on these 3 points? Let's reach consensus on that, and then let's explore the differences a bit more. So we're always moving here between individual and group, and we're always moving between diversity, difference, and consensus, where we're on the same page. These are important meso skills. So a meso practice example is group work that you could do with children that's focused on multiculturalism within the group. And there are some videos in the learning guide about working with children in group settings. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video here, go to your learning guide, click on those links for group work, meso practice, and then come back after you've watched those videos. See you in a minute. Good. Well, I hope it was helpful to see some examples of group work in action. It is quite difficult to video groups. And so quite often the videos that you can find on YouTube for group work are quite difficult to find and often not terribly helpful. So think about the groups that you're in. Your internship class particularly is a small group. So we come to the third level of the generalist intervention model. So we talked about macro, we've talked about meso, and now we're talking about micro. And go in a moment or two and read the section on work with individuals that you find on pages 145 to 148. There are a couple of highlights there. You can leave those out. If you want to read them, that's fine, but they're not awfully useful. So go back to Kirst Ashman, read those few pages, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes. All right, so I hope that reading that passage from Kirst Ashman gives you a clear sense of what micro practice is. It is primarily about work with individuals, but it also includes work with couples and families. And so I'd like you to think about these 3 questions. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and to look up for the answers that you can find in Kirst Ashman. The first is, what are the 4 roles that Kirst Ashman describes for social work practice with individuals? There's 4 roles that she talks about. You may have learned about them last term already, but I want you to go and find them again and link them to social work practice with individuals. Secondly, I'd like you to describe each of these roles in a couple of sentences. So try and talk to yourself, or if you're meeting with a couple of classmates, talk with each other and explain what those roles are, because you're going to be practicing these roles because you're starting with micro practice now, is that you're going to be implementing this micro practice. And I want you to think a bit about what does that look like, okay? And then thirdly, I want you to think of examples of what a social worker might actually do in each of these roles. So try and think of an example where you're working with an individual client, where you apply those roles, and see if you can come up with a practical example of how you, as a social work student, and in the future as a social worker, how you would actually do that. All right, so pause the video. I'll see you again in a moment or two. Great, so welcome back. I hope that was helpful. We're on to our set of micro practice skills. You've learned some of these already in first year. You learned about soul and you listened a bit about listening. And so you had some practice on that in the second semester of first year. And here we're wanting just to pull some of that through. Okay. So some of the main practice skills that you need is listening. And you've heard this before a few times now, right? So listening, actively hearing what someone is saying, but also listening to what they don't say, and also listening to what you can see with your eyes, right? So that you listen with your eyes, you listen with your nose. Maybe they smell like they've been drinking alcohol. So you always want to be listening carefully, actively hearing what someone is saying and what they have not said. Second important skill is called continuing responses, and you'll learn more about these next year. And this are little prompts that facilitates someone to keep talking. And they're very subtle. They're just kind of things like, mm-hmm, oh, really? Uh-huh. Tell me a bit more. Oh, that's interesting. Yes, I hear what you're saying. It's all of these little phrases, little words that we use, but also the nodding and the smiling and the frowning and the use of the face. So your face is really expressive. You can't just sit there with a blanket face the whole time listening to someone and just staring at them like this, right? After a little while, they're going to stop talking and they're going to leave the room. So to be kind of animated and responsive is really important. It helps the client continue to talk. That's why we call them continuing responses. And thirdly is empathic responding, which we've talked about before as well at macro and meso level. It again is an important skill at the micro level. And this is where we might paraphrase a client's feelings. It's not so much that we paraphrase the content of what they've said, but rather that we try to put into words the feeling that they're expressing. And we use this little formula called you feel because. So you feel, and then we would state the feeling that we can hear or see or feel from the client that we're working with. And then we provide the reason for what led to that feeling. And here's an example. You feel angry because your husband humiliated you in public. You feel angry because your husband humiliated you in public. And we tend to find that this kind of way of speaking, which might feel a bit like a formula, after a while, when you begin used to it, you use it quite flexibly. And you could say something like, I can see that your husband's really humiliated you in front of other people, and that leaves you feeling angry. Can you hear it's the same information, right? I just haven't used the formula of you feel because, but all the information is there. And so learning to hear the feeling of your client and to link that feeling that you hear or that you feel in your heart with what they've said and helping the client make that connection can be a very helpful skill to use when you're working with individuals. So back into your learning guide, there is a video from Insoo Kim Berg, who's a couple therapist, and she uses solution-focused therapy as her practice model. And I'd like you to pause in a moment and go pause this video and then go and watch her video about solution-focused couple therapy and then come back into this class. Good. So welcome back. I hope that you found that video with Insoo Kim Berg helpful and interesting. It illustrates two key things. It illustrates work with families, and it also illustrates solution-focused therapy, which you'll learn a bit about next year. So I'm going to ask you to pause again the video and to go and read the section in Kirst Ashman on work with families, which you'll find on pages 148 to 152, and then to answer the questions on the following slide. So I'm going to move across to that slide. So there are these 4 questions that I'd like you to answer from that passage. Firstly, why does Kirst Ashman argue that work with families is a combination of both micro and meso practice? So what is her argument or her rationale for saying this, that it's a combination? Secondly, what do you think it is? Do you think work with families is micro? Do you think it's meso? Right? So you have your own opinion. We have the textbook, but you have an opinion as well. Thirdly, what are some of the things that social workers do to help families? What are some of the things that social workers do to help families? And this should be written up in the textbook under Maluccio, Pine, and Tracy. Question 4 is, what are the 4 types of social support that families might need? And finally, the 5th question, how could you apply these types of social support to social work with families? All right, so I'd like you to pause the video, go and answer those 4 questions and come back when you're ready. Good, so welcome back to micro practice with families. And as we've done before, I'm going to just run through some of the main micro practice skills that we use with families that are a little bit different to what we would use with individuals or groups. So the first one is, you guessed it, listening and empathy, right? So these 2 micro skills of listening and empathy are carry through all of generalist practice, whether you're working with individuals, couples, families, groups, communities, whole countries, we always practice listening and empathy. The second important micro practice skill with families is tracking family interactions. So a little bit like in group work where we talked about sort of seeing who speaks louder and who speaks second and so on. We talked about group think. Similar in a way, we do family think here. So we look for who speaks first, who speaks the most, who speaks the loudest, who's not speaking at all, who shows support for one another and who seems to be critical of one another. So we're always looking for what's happening in the interactions between the members of the family. We're not so much looking at each individual member, but rather what happens in the relationships between individuals within the family group. Does that make sense? We're not so worried about mum, dad, and the 3 kids. We're much more interested in what's happening between mum and dad, what's happening between dad and the oldest child, what's happening between the youngest child and the middle child. So we're looking at what's happening between the relationships, and that's essentially what family therapy is about. A third important skill in micro practice with families is partialization. That means to break big tasks down into small steps. So we may ask the family to go on an outing together, but we can't just tell them go on an outing. We have to break that task down into smaller steps and say, so I want you to get together and talk about where are you going to go? When are you going to go? Make sure that everybody has a voice in making that decision about where you go and when you go. Figure out together who's going to collect what pieces of items that you need. So maybe the one person needs to go and organize some food. Somebody else needs to get chairs and an umbrella because you want to go outside someone. So that somebody, one of the parents, needs to go fill the car with petrol so that you can drive to the next place. So we break big tasks down into small steps and we try and allocate those tasks to the family members. And that leads to the 4th important skill, and that's prescribing homework. So because families live together, unlike groups which generally don't live together, right? So groups will all go back to their own homes during the week and they'll meet once a week with you, but for the rest of the week, they don't see each other. But when you work with a family, they're living together all the time, right? And so we prescribe homework to families, things that they should do during the week between today's session and next session. We set tasks for the family to do during that week. So I hope this micro, meso, macro is now making sense for you and that you can think of examples of work that you could do at these levels and that you have an idea about the kinds of skills that you could use as you practice. So here's the formal definition of generalist social work that we've been talking about. It is the application of an eclectic knowledge-based, professional values, and a wide range of skills to target individual, family, group, organizational, or community systems of change. Eclectic, the word eclectic means a wide range of different kinds of knowledges. Right? And that's why we get you to study psychology and development studies or sociology. We want you to learn to build up a broad range of knowledge. Your professional values, you would have learned some about last term, and you'll learn more about that as you move on. But that is things like confidentiality and ethics and non-judgmentalism. So these are all important values that we have. And then there's a wide range of skills, and we've looked at many of those in today's class. So the question is whether we should be a generalist or rather a specialist. Generalists have skills to work across micro, meso, macro and kind of work with everybody. And a specialist is somebody who would really kind of focus in and focus on a very narrow piece of all of that. So we live in a society that does not regard generalists very highly. If you go to a doctor, you'll often want to see a specialist and not just a general practitioner, a GP, which means that they know a little bit about everything, but they don't know a lot about anything, right? So they have just some general knowledge. But if you have cancer or if you have a tumor in your head, you want to go see a specialist, right? Someone who knows a lot of detailed information about your concern. So there is this tendency for us to want to specialize. So for example, a few years ago, psychology, the profession of psychology, was talking about requiring at least a doctoral degree before psychologists could practice. At the moment, to be a psychologist who practices and does therapy, you need a master's degree. But at a stage, they were saying, no, you also need a doctorate. Why? Because the term Dr. van Breda sounds better than just Mr. van Breda. And so it was really all about prestige and specialization. And so I want you to think a little bit about what are the advantages and disadvantages of generalist practice and social work. What are the advantages of being able to do everything, even if it's not very well? And what are the disadvantages of doing that? And on the other hand, what are the advantages of being a specialist? And what are the disadvantages of that? So pause the video here and give that a bit of thought, jot down some notes, and then I'll see you in a minute or two. Okay, so welcome back. These are some of my thoughts around this. Some of the advantages of generalist practice is that you can practice flexibly wherever the needs are. And so when someone needs support, you have the skills to be able to help them, even if you don't know the specific details about the thing that they're struggling with. Being a generalist means that you have grassroots relevance to the majority of citizens. So when we work in a community, people have very, very diverse needs. And being a generalist allows you to move across all of those needs and to provide relevance at a grassroots level. Thirdly, you learn critical thinking skills to develop you as a professional rather than just filling you with fragmented bits of knowledge. So the plan change process, for example, the engage, assess, plan, implement, evaluate, terminate, is something that you can use with any client of any size, with any problem. It gives you a tool that's really wide and inclusive. And when you work as a generalist, you have a very varied and interesting kind of workload. You're not just seeing the same thing over and over every day. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages. You become a little bit good at everything, but often not very good at anything. And in English, we have this old expression that you're a jack of all trades and master of none. It means you can do everything a little bit, not great, but a little bit, but you're not actually a master. You're not really highly skilled in anything. And the result of that is that you can get stretched into many diverse roles, and that can become very tiring. So right now you're working individually with an abused child, and the next minute you're doing a community project where you're lobbying for more security on street corners, and then all of a sudden you're working with a group of alcoholics. And so you can really kind of sort of lose your mind with all of these things. It can be really tiring. And also you can be seen as being a jack of all trades and master of none, and that can result in a lack of credibility amongst other professionals. So here we are at our last slide. Thank you for sticking around for these 40 minutes of this lecture. So just a reminder that generalist practice is about macro interventions at the community level. And one of our colleagues, Joyce Lungwani, used to be a tutor, and she always used to say to her students, Remember macro, that place where you go and buy everything in bulk. You could buy chips and sweets and, toilet paper in bulk. That's macro. It's the big one. Meso interventions are with groups of people, usually small groups, and micro interventions are with individuals, couples, and families. And what we've looked at is some of the skills for all of these, as well as the advantages and disadvantages. And so I hope that you have found this useful as we have worked together today. All right, take care, everybody. Cheers.